The fluorescent lights above me flickered like dying stars as I clutched my abdomen, doubled over in the hospital waiting room. The pain had started as a dull ache that morning, but now it felt like someone was twisting a rusty knife through my intestines. Every breath sent lightning bolts of agony coursing through my body, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. "Please," I whispered to the triage nurse, my voice barely audible over the chaos of the emergency room. "Something's really wrong. The pain is getting worse." She glanced up from her computer, her eyes already moving past me to the next person in line. "Stomach bugs can be rough, honey. Take a seat and we'll call you when a room opens up." But this wasn't a stomach bug. Deep in my bones, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Mom's number. Surely she'd understand. Surely she'd drop everything and come be with me like any mother would when her daughter was in crisis. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, and I could hear the elegant tinkling of champagne glasses and classical music in the background. Of course, Isabella's charity gala was tonight, the event Mom had been planning for months to showcase my younger sister's humanitarian work. The golden child was being honored again, and I was just the forgotten afterthought bleeding out in a hospital. Waiting room. "Emma? This better be important. You know tonight is Isabella's big night." Mom's voice carried that familiar edge of irritation. The same tone she'd used when I'd interrupted her garden parties as a child, with scraped knees and broken toys. "Mom, I'm in the hospital," I managed to gasp between waves of pain. "Something's really wrong. I need you here." The silence stretched for what felt like eternity, punctuated only by the distant sound of applause from whatever speech Isabella was probably giving about saving the world. When Mom finally spoke, her words hit me like a physical blow. "Emma, you're being overdramatic again. You always do this when Isabella has something important happening. Can't you see a doctor and handle this yourself? You're 26 years old, for crying out loud. Overdramatic." The word echoed in my mind as my vision blurred around the edges. I'd heard it my entire life, whenever I'd tried to express pain, fear, or need. When I'd broken my arm at 12 and cried, I was being overdramatic. When I'd had panic attacks in high school, I was being overdramatic. When I'd graduated summa cum laude from nursing school and asked them to attend my ceremony, I was being overdramatic for expecting them to choose me over one of Isabella's equestrian competitions. "I think my appendix might have ruptured," I whispered, but the line had already gone dead. I stared at the phone in my shaking hands, watching as my sister's latest Instagram story played automatically. There she was in a stunning emerald gown, radiant and perfect as always, accepting some humanitarian award while our parents beamed with pride in the background. The caption read, "So grateful for my amazing family's support tonight. Some dreams really do come true." The irony wasn't lost on me. While Isabella was being celebrated for her compassion and dedication to helping others, I was dying alone because my own family couldn't be bothered to show me an ounce of that same compassion. "Emma Rodriguez?" A nurse's voice cut through my spiral of despair. I looked up to see a woman with kind eyes and graying hair approaching with a wheelchair. Something in her expression told me she'd seen enough genuine emergencies to recognize one when she saw it. "Let's get you back there." "Sweetheart, you don't look good at all." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of pain and medical jargon. Blood tests, CT scans, concerned whispers between doctors. I caught fragments of their conversations. Acute appendicitis, signs of perforation, emergency surgery. We need to move fast. Dr. Martinez, the surgeon, sat on the edge of my bed with the kind of gentle authority that comes from years of delivering life-changing news. "Emma, your appendix has indeed ruptured. You're going into septic shock, which means the infection is spreading throughout your body. We need to get you into surgery immediately." The words washed over me like ice water. Septic shock. People died from septic shock. How long do I have? I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. We're taking you up now, he said, signaling to the surgical team already prepping my bed for transport. Is there anyone you'd like us to call? Family? A partner? I thought about Mom and Dad, probably raising their champagne glasses in toast to Isabella's latest achievement. I thought about the way Mom's voice had dripped with disdain when she'd called me overdramatic. I thought about the years of coming second, third, or not at all in their list of priorities. No, I said quietly. There's no one. The surgical suite was a cathedral of white light and controlled chaos. As the anesthesia mask descended over my face, I wondered if this was how it would end, if I'd become just another cautionary tale about the girl who cried wolf, except I'd never cried wolf. I just had the misfortune of being born into a family that saw my pain as inconvenience and my needs as selfishness. The last thing I remembered before the darkness took me was the sound of my heart monitor, beeping steadily like a countdown to something I couldn't name. I woke up to the sound of machines and the antiseptic smell of recovery. My throat felt like sandpaper, and there was a strange, hollow ache where the pain used to be. For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot why I was here. Then it all came rushing back. The pain, the phone call, the surgery, the silence where my family's concern should have been. A different nurse, younger this time, was checking my IV. She smiled when she saw my eyes open. Welcome back, Emma. You gave us quite a scare there. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, I croaked. That's pretty normal after what you've been through. Dr. Martinez wants to talk to you about the surgery. It was touch and go for a while. Touch and go. The words settled in my chest like stones. I'd nearly died, and my parents didn't even know. They were probably still at the after-party, regaling strangers with stories of Isabella's compassion and brilliance. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, still in his scrubs. The exhaustion in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about how close I'd come to not waking up at all. Emma, I'm glad to see you awake. We removed your appendix, but it had been ruptured for several hours before you got here. We had to clean out a significant amount of infection from your abdominal cavity. You lost a lot of blood during the procedure. He sat down, his expression growing more serious. I have to ask, when did the pain start? Because the damage we found suggests you'd been suffering for much longer than you initially indicated. I thought back to the morning, to the way I'd dismissed the initial discomfort as stress or something I'd eaten. It started this morning, but I thought it was just a stomachache. It didn't get really bad until this afternoon. Emma, your body was already in the early stages of sepsis when you arrived. If you'd waited even a few more hours to come in. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. I'd nearly died because I'd tried to tough it out, because I'd been conditioned my entire life to believe that my pain wasn't worth anyone's attention, even my own. There was significant internal bleeding during the surgery, Dr. Martinez continued. We had to give you several units of blood. You're going to need to take it easy for the next few weeks. Is there someone who can help take care of you during your recovery? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Someone to take care of me. The concept felt foreign, almost laughable. When had anyone in my family ever taken care of me? When had I ever been anyone's priority? I'll figure something out, I said, because what else was there to say? Over the next 3 days in the hospital, my phone remained stubbornly silent. No calls from Mom asking how I was doing. No texts from Dad checking if I needed anything. Isabella posted 17 more Instagram stories from various post-gala brunches and spa days, but apparently none of them involved asking where her sister had disappeared to. The nurses, bless them, began to treat me like a member of their own family. Sarah, the night nurse, would sit with me during her breaks and tell me about her daughter's soccer games. Miguel, the day nurse, brought me crossword puzzles and terrible jokes. They filled the silence where my family's concern should have been, and I was grateful for their kindness, even as it highlighted the absence of those who should have been there. On my last night in the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I was staring at my phone, thumb hovering over Mom's number, when I realized I was waiting for them to care. I was still, even after nearly dying alone, waiting for them to prove that I mattered. But they'd already shown me who they were. They'd been showing me for 26 years. I deleted the unsent message and instead opened my laptop. If I was going to rebuild my life, I needed to start with the truth. I needed to start with letting go of the family that had already let go of me. The apartment felt different when I finally came home. Smaller somehow, like it had shrunk to accommodate my new understanding of how alone I really was. My recovery was slow and painful, both physically and emotionally. Simple tasks like showering or cooking left me exhausted, and I had to rely on grocery delivery and the kindness of my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who brought me soup and asked no questions about why no one else was helping. It was during those long, quiet days of healing that I began to see my life with startling clarity. I'd spent years making excuses for my parents' behavior, telling myself they were just busy, just focused on Isabella because she needed more attention. But the truth was simpler and more painful. They'd never seen me as worth their time or concern. I started writing, at first just journal entries to process the trauma of nearly dying alone. But gradually, the writing became something more. It became a record of a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and minimized. It became the story of a daughter who'd nearly bled out while her parents partied, calling her concerns overdramatic, even as her life hung in the balance. 3 weeks. After my surgery, my phone finally rang with Mom's contact. I stared at it, watching it buzz against my coffee table as I sat in my pajamas, still weak, but no longer waiting for their acknowledgement of my pain. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to it later, Mom's voice was tight with irritation. "Emma, I don't know what game you're playing, but it's time to stop being childish. Isabella's engagement party is next month, and we need to discuss your role as maid of honor. Call me back. Maid of honor." After everything, she wanted me to smile and play the supportive sister, to pretend that I hadn't nearly died while they celebrated Isabella's latest triumph. The audacity of it took my breath away. I saved the voicemail, not because I planned to respond, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment I realized that in their minds, I would always be the supporting character in Isabella's story, never the protagonist of my own. That night, I started making plans. Real plans, for a life that didn't revolve around earning love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. The months that followed were both the hardest and most liberating of my life. I threw myself into my work at the pediatric ICU, finding purpose in caring for children whose families would do anything to save them. I made new friends, real friends who called when I was sick and celebrated my small victories. I started therapy, finally unpacking the years of emotional neglect I'd normalized as just family dynamics. Most importantly, I maintained my silence. Every few weeks, one of them would try to reach out. Dad's gruff voicemails demanding I stop punishing the family. Isabella's confused texts asking why I was being weird about her engagement. Mom's increasingly frantic messages about family obligations and how my absence was reflecting poorly. On all of them, I saved every message, every voicemail, every passive-aggressive text. They became a reminder of why I'd made this choice, evidence of how even my absence was framed in terms of how it affected them, never in terms of what might have driven me away. Isabella's engagement party came and went without me. I saw the photos on social media later, the family looking slightly awkward in group shots where my absence was obvious. Mom's smile just a little too tight around the edges. The caption mentioned my work obligations, a lie I hadn't authorized, but appreciated for its convenience. At work, my colleagues began to notice the change in me. I smiled more easily, laughed without the undercurrent of anxiety that had always shadowed my interactions. I took on extra shifts not because I was running from something, but because I genuinely loved the work. I was becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be, free from the constant weight of trying to earn love that was never offered freely. "You seem lighter," Sarah observed one day as we worked side by side in the PICU. "Like you've been carrying something heavy and finally put it down." She was right. I had been carrying something heavy. The belief that I was responsible for making my family love me. That if I just tried harder, needed less, and gave more, I could earn my place in their hearts. Letting go of that burden had been like removing a tumor, painful, but ultimately necessary for my survival. 6 months after my surgery, I moved to a new apartment across town. It was smaller than my old place, but filled with light, and for the first time in my life, every piece of furniture, every decoration, every choice was entirely mine. I painted the walls deep blue, hung art that spoke to my soul rather than what my parents would approve of, and created a space that felt like home in a way their house never had. I was happy, not the manic, desperate happiness I'd performed for years, trying to prove I was worth loving, but a quiet, steady contentment that came from finally accepting that I was enough, exactly as I was. That contentment was tested on a rainy Tuesday evening in October when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Emma?" It was Isabella's voice, but strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Emma, please don't hang up. I got your number from your work. I know you're mad at us, but I need you." The words sent a chill down my spine. Isabella had never needed me for anything. She was the perfect daughter, the one who had everything figured out, the one who commanded everyone's attention and adoration without effort. "What's wrong?" I asked, despite myself. "It's Mom. She's in the hospital. She had a heart attack, Emma. A bad one. The doctors, they say she might not make it." The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. Now, when it was Mom lying in a hospital bed, suddenly my medical knowledge mattered. Suddenly they needed the daughter they'd dismissed as overdramatic when she was bleeding out on an operating table. "Which hospital?" I heard myself ask. "St. Mary's. She's in the cardiac ICU." "Emma, please. Dad's falling apart and I don't know what to do. You're a nurse. You understand these things. We need you. We need you." The words I'd waited my entire life to hear, finally spoken when the stakes were impossibly high and the emotional cost of returning was almost unbearable. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, and immediately questioned my own sanity. The drive to St. Mary's felt like traveling through time, each mile taking me back to a version of myself I'd worked so hard to leave behind. But as I parked in this familiar hospital garage, I realized I wasn't the same person who'd nearly died alone in an emergency room 8 months ago. I was stronger now, clearer about my own worth, and I was choosing to be here not because I owed them anything, but because it was the right thing to do. The cardiac ICU smelled different from the pediatric ward where I worked, heavy with the weight of adult lives hanging in balance. I found them in the family waiting area. Dad slumped in a chair looking older than I'd ever seen him. Isabella pacing by the windows with tears streaming down her perfect cheeks. They both looked up when I entered, and for a moment nobody spoke. The silence stretched between us, filled with 8 months of unanswered calls and unspoken recriminations. "Emma," Dad said finally, his voice breaking on my name. "You came." "How is she?" I asked, bypassing the emotional minefield of their relief. At seeing me, Isabella launched into a stammering account of the morning's events. Mom had been gardening, preparing for another of her elaborate dinner parties when she'd collapsed in the rose garden. Dad had found her unconscious, and by the time the paramedics arrived, she'd been without oxygen for several critical minutes. "The doctors say she needs surgery, but there are complications," Her heart? It's not strong enough right now. They're waiting to see if she stabilizes, Isabella finished, her voice thick with tears. I nodded, processing the medical information with the clinical detachment I'd learned to maintain in crisis situations. What's her cardiologist's name? I can speak with the team, find out more details. For the next several hours, I found myself slipping back into the role I'd rejected months ago, the capable daughter who handled the practical matters while everyone else fell apart. I spoke with doctors, translated medical jargon for my father and sister, and coordinated with the surgical team about Mom's care plan. But something was different this time. I wasn't doing it from a place of desperate need for their approval. I was doing it because I was good at it, because it was the right thing to do, and because despite everything, I still loved them enough to want to help. It was after midnight when Mom finally stabilized enough for surgery. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, unconscious and fragile in a way I'd never seen her, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of our shared humanity. She was fallible, mortal, flawed in ways that had shaped my entire childhood. But she was also someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who was fighting for her life. She's going to be okay, I told Dad and Isabella as we settled in for the long wait. Dr. Kim is excellent. I've worked with him before. Dad looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before, gratitude mixed with something that might have been shame. Emma, I need to say something. What happened when you were sick, when we weren't there for you? That wasn't right. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, 8 months too late, but still carrying weight. Isabella looked confused, glancing between us with the expression of someone who'd missed a crucial part of the story. What happened when Emma was sick? She asked. I found myself in the strange position of having to explain my own medical crisis to my sister, who'd been so wrapped up in her gala and its aftermath that she'd never even noticed I'd disappeared. As I recounted the night of my surgery, watching her face change from confusion to horror to something that might have been understanding, I realized how completely my absence from their lives had gone unnoticed. You almost died? Isabella whispered. And we weren't there? You were busy, I said simply. It's fine. I handled it. But it wasn't fine, and we all knew it. The truth sat between us like a living thing, ugly and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Emma, Dad said again, his voice rough with exhaustion and regret. I'm sorry. We failed you. I failed you. The apology I'd waited my entire life to hear came in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, while Mom fought for her life 3 floors above us. It should have felt triumphant, vindicated, healing. Instead, it just felt tired. I know, I said. We sat in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts as the hours crawled by. I dozed fitfully in my chair, my body remembering the bone-deep exhaustion of my own recovery, my heart wrestling with the complexity of loving people who'd hurt me so deeply. Dawn was breaking through the waiting room windows when Dr. Kim finally appeared, still in his surgical scrubs, but smiling. The surgery went very well. We were able to clear the blockages and repair the damage. She's going to need significant recovery time, but she should make a full recovery. The relief in the room was palpable. Isabella burst into fresh tears, and Dad buried his face in his hands. I felt my own shoulders sag as the tension I'd been carrying finally released. Can we see her? Dad asked. She's still unconscious from the anesthesia, but you can visit briefly. Family only, though. I understand you're all... Dr. Kim paused, looking at me with mild confusion. I'm sorry. Are you medical staff or family? It was Isabella who answered, her voice clear and certain for the first time all night. She's family. She's our sister. The words hit me unexpectedly, carrying weight they'd never held before. Not because the genetic relationship had changed, but because it felt, for the first time, like they truly meant it. Mom looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by tubes and monitors in a way that made her seem almost fragile. Her face, usually so carefully composed, was slack with medication and exhaustion, but she was breathing steadily. And the monitors showed a heart rhythm that was strong and regular. "She looks so peaceful," Isabella whispered. "Anesthesia will do that," I said automatically, then caught myself falling back into the role of family translator. She should wake up in the next few hours. We stayed with her through the morning shift change, taking turns sitting by her bed and making awkward conversation in the hallway. It was strange, this tentative dance of reconnection, like learning to speak a language I'd once been fluent in but had deliberately forgotten. When Mom finally opened her eyes around noon, the first person she saw was me. For a moment, confusion flickered across her features, as if she couldn't quite place me in this context. "Emma?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "What are you doing here?" It was such a perfectly characteristic question, focused on my presence as an anomaly rather than expressing relief or gratitude, that I almost laughed. Some things apparently didn't change even when you were recovering from major heart surgery. "You had a heart attack," I explained gently. "You're in the hospital. You just had surgery, but you're going to be fine." She absorbed this information, slowly, her eyes moving from me to the machines surrounding her bed to Dad and Isabella hovering anxiously nearby. "The dinner party," she said suddenly. "The Hendersons are coming tonight." "Mom, the dinner party can wait," Isabella said, moving closer to the bed. "You almost died." Almost died. The words echoed strangely in the room, carrying the weight of recent history none of us had fully processed. I watched Mom's face as she struggled to understand her situation, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Real, undeniable fragility that couldn't be managed or controlled or dismissed as overdramatic. "How long will I be here?" she asked, directing the question to me with an assumption of medical authority that felt both familiar and strange. "Probably a few days for monitoring, then several weeks of recovery at home. You'll need cardiac rehabilitation, medication adjustments, lifestyle changes." I recited the standard post-surgical protocols automatically. "Will you?" she started, then stopped, her eyes flickering with something that might have been uncertainty. "Will you help me understand what the doctors say? You always were good at explaining medical things." The request was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of our fractured relationship. But it was also the first time in my memory that she'd acknowledged something I was good at, the first time she'd asked for my help, not as a last resort, but as a first choice. "Of course," I said. Over the next few days, I found myself sliding into a routine I hadn't planned. I would visit in the mornings before my shift at the pediatric ICU, translating doctor's orders and explaining medication side effects. I would check in during my lunch breaks, bringing Mom the kind of detailed updates about her progress that I knew she needed to feel in control. I would stop by after work, answering the same questions she'd ask every day as her mind struggled to process the reality of her condition. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't a magical reconciliation that erased years of neglect and dismissal. It was something more complicated and more real, the slow, careful construction of a relationship between two adults who shared a history but were learning to see each other clearly for the first time. Isabella, meanwhile, seemed to be having her own awakening. The sister I'd known as effortlessly perfect was struggling with the weight of suddenly being needed in a practical way. She'd always been the family's shining star, the one who looked good in photos and gave inspiring speeches, but she'd never had to navigate insurance paperwork or coordinate with home health services or research cardiac rehabilitation programs. "I don't know how you do it," she said one evening as we sat in Mom's room while she dozed. "Understanding all this medical stuff, talking to the doctors like you speak their language. I feel so useless." "You're not useless," I said, and meant it. "You're just learning a different skill set. Mom's going to need emotional support during her recovery too, and you're good at that." She looked at me with something like surprise. "You think I'm good at emotional support?" It occurred to me that for all the attention Isabella had received throughout our lives, it had mostly been for her achievements and appearances. Maybe she'd been as trapped in her role as I'd been in mine. Expected to be perfect and inspiring while I was expected to be practical and invisible. "You are," I said. "You have a way of making people feel hopeful. Mom's going to need that." We were building something new, the three of us. Not the family we'd been, with its clearly defined roles and unspoken hierarchies, but something more, honest and more equal. It was messy and awkward and sometimes painful, but it was real in a way our old dynamics had never been. Dad was the hardest to navigate. His guilt over my surgery seemed to have awakened something in him that he didn't know how to handle. He would hover around the edges of conversations, starting to say something important and then trailing off into silence. He brought me coffee every morning during Mom's stay, as if caffeine could somehow compensate for a lifetime of emotional unavailability. "I should have been there," he said one morning as we waited for Mom's discharge paperwork. "When you were sick, I should have been there." "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." He flinched at my directness, but I was done protecting other people from the consequences of their choices. He had failed me when I needed him most, and acknowledging that fact was necessary for any real healing to begin. "I want to do better," he said quietly. "I don't know how, but I want to try." "Then try," I said. "Start now, start small, but try." When Mom was finally discharged, there was an unspoken assumption that I would be involved in her care. Not as the primary caregiver, but as the medical interpreter, the one who could spot concerning symptoms and communicate with her doctors. It felt strange to be needed by people who'd spent so long making me feel unnecessary, but it also felt like a chance to redefine our relationship on terms that acknowledged my value. The first few weeks of Mom's recovery were challenging for all of us. She chafed against the restrictions of her new reality, frustrated by her body's limitations and the slow pace of healing. I found myself having to set boundaries I'd never set before, insisting that she follow her medication schedule and attend physical therapy sessions, even when she tried to dismiss them as unnecessary. "You're being bossy," she complained one afternoon when I refused to let her help plan Isabella's wedding from her hospital bed. "You're being stubborn," I replied calmly. "And your heart can't handle the stress of event planning right now." It was a new dynamic for us, this honest push and pull without the underlying current of my desperate need for approval. I could stand firm in my medical recommendations because I wasn't doing it to prove my worth or earn her love. I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, and because I finally understood that my knowledge and expertise had value independent of her recognition. Isabella's wedding became a strange focal point for our family's healing. Originally planned as another elaborate showcase, the event was scaled back to something smaller and more intimate after Mom's heart attack. Isabella seemed relieved by the change, confessing to me that she'd felt overwhelmed by the pressure to make everything perfect. "I always felt like I had to be worthy of all the attention," she admitted one day, as we sat in Mom's garden, which had been transformed into a simpler but more beautiful space during her recovery. Like if I wasn't achieving something spectacular, I didn't deserve to be the favorite. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged the favoritism that had shaped our childhood, and I felt something heavy shift in my chest. "You were never my competition," I told her. "I just wanted them to see me too." "I see you now," she said quietly. "I'm sorry it took so long." The wedding was lovely in its simplicity. Isabella glowed with genuine happiness rather than performative perfection, and her new husband looked at her with the kind of steady adoration that suggested he loved her for who she was, not what she achieved. Mom, still weak but determined to be present, watched from a comfortable chair rather than managing every detail from behind the scenes. I stood as maid of honor after all, not because I'd been guilted into it, but because Isabella had asked me as her sister, not as a supporting player in her story. It felt different, this role, when it came from genuine affection rather than family obligation. During her speech at the reception, Isabella surprised everyone by deviating from her prepared remarks. "I want to thank my sister Emma," she said, looking directly at me across the small gathering, "for showing me what real strength looks like, and for being there when we needed you most, even when we hadn't been there for you." The words hung in the warm evening air, and I felt tears threatening for the first time in months. Not tears of sadness or anger, but something more complex, a grief for the years we'd lost, mixed with hope for the relationship we were building. After the wedding, life settled into a new rhythm. Mom's recovery continued steadily, her natural controlling tendencies channeled into following her rehabilitation plan with military precision. Dad made awkward but genuine attempts to connect with me, asking about my work and actually listening to the answers. Isabella called regularly, not just during family crises, but to share small moments and ask for advice about married life. But the most significant change was in how I moved through the world. The constant anxiety I'd carried for so long, the fear that I wasn't good enough or worthy enough to deserve love, had finally loosened its grip. I dated more confidently, pursued friendships more openly, and took professional risks that led to a promotion at the hospital. I also started writing again, but this time, not just in my journal. I began crafting the story of my family's journey, from dysfunction to healing, not as an act of revenge, but as a way of processing the complexity of loving people who'd hurt you. The writing became a bridge between who I'd been and who I was becoming. A year after Mom's heart attack, we gathered for the first family dinner I'd attended in almost 2 years. It was smaller than the elaborate affairs of my childhood, just the 4 of us around Mom's kitchen table with takeout from our favorite restaurant. But it was also more real, filled with actual conversation rather than performance. "I've been thinking about something," Mom said as we cleared the dishes. "About the night you were in surgery, Emma. I've been thinking about it a lot." The room went quiet. We'd skirted around the edges of that night many times, but never addressed it head on. "I was afraid," she continued, her voice steady but quiet. "Not just about Isabella's event, but about what it might mean if something was really wrong with you. I was afraid that if I acknowledged how serious it was, I'd have to face how badly I'd failed as your mother. So I called you overdramatic instead, because that was easier than admitting I was scared. It wasn't the apology I'd imagined in my angriest moments, full of dramatic declarations and promises to change. It was smaller and more honest, the kind of truth that comes from real self-reflection rather than crisis management. I was scared too," I said, "but not just of dying. I was scared of dying alone, of not mattering enough for anyone to be with me." "You matter," Dad said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "You've always mattered. We didn't know how to show it. We thought providing for you was enough, thought that if we could give you opportunities, an education, and a good life, that was the same as showing love. We were wrong." Isabella reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We were all wrong, but we're here now, and we're trying." It wasn't perfect. Families like ours don't transform overnight, and the scars from years of emotional neglect don't heal just because everyone finally acknowledges they exist. But it was a beginning, a foundation we could build on with patience and honesty, and the kind of love that's chosen rather than assumed. Months later, I was working a night shift in the PICU when my phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. She'd sent a photo of Mom in her garden, kneeling carefully among her roses with a smile of genuine contentment on her face. The caption read, "Look who's back to her favorite therapy. She says the flowers listen better than her doctors." I smiled, saving the photo to my camera roll. It was such a small moment, the kind of family update that most people take for granted. But for us, it represented something precious. The ordinary intimacy of people who choose to stay connected, even when it's complicated. My phone buzzed again. this time with a message from Mom herself. "Working late again? Don't forget to eat something. Love you. Love you." 2 words that had been so rare in our family's vocabulary that they still felt foreign and precious. But they were becoming more frequent, more natural, more real. I typed back, "Love you too. Take your medications." Already did. Stop being such a bossy nurse. Stop being such a stubborn patient. It was playful in a way our interactions had never been before, light and affectionate without the undercurrent of fear and resentment that had shadowed our relationship for so long. We were learning to love each other as we actually were, rather than as the people we thought we should be. Looking back, I can see that my near-death experience was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of the version of myself that would accept crumbs of affection and call it love, that would excuse neglect as family dynamics and minimize my own needs to avoid being called overdramatic. But it was also the beginning of something better, a family built on choice rather than obligation, on honesty rather than performance, on the kind of love that's earned through consistency and care rather than assumed through shared genetics. I nearly bled out on an operating table while my parents partied at my sister's gala, dismissing my pain as overdramatic. That night could have been the end of our story, a tragic tale of family dysfunction and medical crisis. Instead, it became the catalyst for something none of us had thought possible: real healing, real connection, real love. The scars from my surgery have faded. Now, barely visible lines across my abdomen that remind me how close I came to losing everything. But the emotional scars took longer to heal, and in some ways, they'll always be part of who I am. They're reminders of my strength, of my ability to survive alone when I had to, and of my wisdom in finally choosing to rebuild rather than simply endure. Some people say you can't choose your family, and in the genetic sense, that's true. But in every way that matters, I've learned that family is exactly what you choose to build, maintain, and nurture. It's the people who show up when you're bleeding, who learn from their failures, and who choose love even when it's difficult. My wine. Family chose me, finally. But more importantly, I chose them back, on my own terms, with my own boundaries, and with the full knowledge of my own worth. And that choice, made freely and with clear eyes, has made all the difference.